Welcome to a critical history of our IPS, Part 1, 1864 to 1930. First of all, I'd like to thank Flanner House and Director Brandon Cosby, Sandra Green, Director of Operations, and Kurt Butler, the IT Director. I would also like to thank Wise, my research assistant, who will be helping us in today's conversations. Because it's the 200th anniversary of the state of Indiana, a critical history of our IPS is being presented by the Charles E. Loflin and Virginia Vornum-Loflin Center on the History of the Indianapolis Public Schools. My parents, Ed and Jen, were IPS dropouts. In the 1920s, my dad left school 5 in the 5th grade, and my mom left Washington High School her freshman year. And it's being presented today because on Monday, September the 12th, 1927, exactly 89 years ago, attics opened. Although the center is about IPS history, the goal of the center is to question the purpose of schools and the intent of public education. To do this, the center will examine, then unpack the history of formal education and schooling in America from Columbus to the present. The center is a place where interested parties can read, research, discuss, debate, and publish around the intent of public education, using our IPS as the model American narrative, a frame of reference expanding from IPS to topics, interests, and research in depth in all directions. The center's orientation is based on the Richardson-Loflin theory that evolved from an interview I had with Mr. Henry J. Richardson in the fall of 1979. There's Mr. Richardson there, as I knew him back then. You will learn more about Mr. Richardson in a play I wrote from our conversation. And you'll be able to read this play and listen to Mr. Richardson talk like he did that afternoon at our center's oral history collection. According to Mr. Richardson, a series of trade-offs, or what he called one big deal, took place in late 1922. This deal created a new state of affairs in Indianapolis. He noted in the plan that the power structure of Indianapolis were basically saying this about its public schools. We will create attics for the blacks. We'll create Washington on the other side, on the west side, on the other side of White River for the Eastern and Southern Europeans. We'll expand Manual from the south side for the south side, Germans, Italians, Jews, and other working classes. And we'll move Shortridge up to the north side away from all this mess. Here we see that Manual High School had 3 synagogues. This is a synagogue here, that's a synagogue there, and down the street was the poor synagogue, the Peddler Shul on South Meridian. For the Loflin part of the Loflin-Richardson theory, I'll add Cathedral High School and Butler to the mix. The questions for us today is, who were the we that Henry Richardson was talking about, and what's this mess he was talking about that they felt they were in and trying to get out of? To Richardson, the we are what he called Main Street, the 1920 status quo, an oligarchy of businesses and businessmen and economic elites and social and cultural elites and the political ideological elites of Indianapolis. Of course, this will be better reflected and understood by reading copies of the Indianapolis Recorder from this era. However, according to the IUP library and our own public library, all Recorder papers from 1916 to 1926 are gone and cannot be located. All that being said, settle back, relax, enjoy this trip back to the past. So let's get started. Basically, we're going to have these questions, especially based on the documentary that was out by Ted Green on the history of Attucks High School. And here are our questions. If what the Attucks documentary said is true, that it was the Chamber of Commerce, the Federation of Civic Clubs, and the Citizens School Committee that created Attucks, and not the Klan, why did these educated successful, upstanding citizens who were members of these groups create a Jim Crow IPS public school system. Next, the Attucks film notes that Butler established a quota on the number of blacks who would be admitted to the college to 10 per year. It did that in 1927, the same year that Attucks opened. But why? Next, we're going to be at the end connecting the dots, because that's what scholars do. We take what was in the past and see if it's relevant to today's issues. And so we're going to ask that question. What is relevant? What is the relevance of our discussion to today's Indianapolis and the Indianapolis public schools? And finally, I got it under a line here because evidently you're not supposed to talk about this because the recorders have been missing a long time. What happened to those papers? That's around 520 missing papers. What happened, and more importantly, what are we going to do about it? The really basis of this presentation is this point right here. When you control the schools, you control the future. Every dictator knows this. Every society knows this. The North Koreans have their ideology and their worldview, which is passed on to their next generation through the school system. The South Koreans, just a few miles south of that border, are also presenting their worldview and their values through the schools to their students, because they know when you control what's going on in the schools, you can control the future of the society. But we have Maury Evans here, and excuse me for reading this, and you can read it. Very important quote to help us, because what we're going to try to do today is understand the zeitgeist, what was going on in the 1920s that influenced these, again, upstanding, well-educated, successful people to create a Jim Crow school system. And what is it about Indianapolis then and today that made this happen? Let's see what Maury Evans said, who's a nationally acclaimed writer and poet and activist. For a span of my memory, this has been a city of opposing wills, two faces firmly set toward different directions, one covertly determined to maintain the status quo, to continually block any access to power or to parity, the other advocating an active morality and its right to inclusion as an equal entity rather than a colonized one. This has been a city of perpetual confrontation, however cloaked, between the powerless and those who influence, control, and engineer the city's movement in the exorable and often ruthless march toward greatness. We have here what Thomas Brown, Reverend Tom Brown said. I don't think Indianapolis has ever been a place for radical or even progressive politics. Historically, it's been a place where you rear your family and people and smile, even if there's nothing to smile about. Everybody acts right and stays in their place. David Hoppy of Nouveau says it even better. What may set Indianapolis apart, though, is the local emphasis on getting along. Being a team player, fitting in, seems to be more crucial here than at other places. To get ahead of Indy, you mustn't want to change things, but improve them, oh, so gradually. And finally here, which I think is really important, and that's what we're going to be doing, help Indianapolis be who it is, be what it is, because it hasn't been what it is, because it's afraid if it is what it is, people won't like it. And we'll see why. The most frightening thing about Indianapolis is Indianapolis. The fact that it continues to undermine itself by being something other than what it is or who it is. So up until the Ted Greenfield film, people thought that the Klan, for example, created Attucks High School. That was the urban legend that went around for years and years and years. But that wasn't true. Now that this is out in the open. But Indianapolis would rather be the city where the Klan created Attucks High School rather than a city that its own city leaders, its own politicians and business people and successful citizens created this Jim Crow system. That's a story that the city really doesn't want to face, but it's going to have to now. To help us understand what influenced people Not that their own individual decisions were theirs, but what was going on around them in that era of the 1920s. First of all, we had the Roaring Twenties itself, a wild, crazy time of the Great Gatsby, where a lot of things were happening. Money was an object of a lot of people's interest, and having a good time was the object of a lot of people's interest. So the Roaring Twenties were not the Roaring Twenties. It was not described as that for nothing. We had Prohibition, which made gangsters sell bootleg liquor. We had what we called the flappers, the prom girls, or the Raxes, because women were not only getting the right to vote, but they were, the young women especially, were trying to get away from the idea that how they dressed, how they acted, how they appeared was something that was not their way of doing things. They wanted to break away and be their own generation. We had Model T. We had talkies. We had electric lights, electric appliances, the iron, the radio, the record player. We had radicals because Russia and the Bolsheviks had just had the revolution. And we had the White Plague, which is TB. We had labor unions. We had, again, the alcohol was called hooch or white mule, against the law, of course. This is very significant. For the first time on January the 14th, 1921, according to the 1920 census, there were more people living in the city than in the country. So finally, urbanization had taken place, where in the past that wasn't the case. This is very important. We'll find out more about David Starr Jordan, who was a eugenicist who taught at Shortridge and Butler and IU, and took his friends out, some of his students out to Stanford, and they created the IQ test, and they created tracking, and they also pushed eugenics. And we'll find out what eugenics is in our presentation. We had the so-called Negro problem, which is basically that, if you will, black folks want to be social equals. And they could be anything but social equals. We'll find out more about that. Of course, this is what the white folks said about the problem. The Negroes didn't think they had a problem, other than the white people. The telephone was invented. We had the beginning of consumer society. We had this book that came out, The Rising Tide of Color Against the White World Supremacy, because it appeared that white people in particular, were not so much worried about black people per se. They were more worried about the fact that the number of white people was being reduced, that they were going to disappear due to the amalgamation between the races, and that the white race would soon disappear due to the over numbers of people of color. We had the beginning of these terrible race riots, independence in Kansas City, Missouri. We had here in December 1920 and in May and June of 1921, large race riots in these towns. We had the creation of the IQ test. That's going to be up here. We'll see what David Starr Jordan was a part of the IQ test. We had a lot of the soldiers who returned from World War I were addicted to morphine, and of course opium from China and the East was also available, and so that was an issue with a lot of people. We had immigration and restrictions. We had the Jazz Age. People thought that jazz was just changing the values and the society too much. It scared a lot of traditional people. We had Americanism, which means you had to be born here. You had to be 100% American, which means you were born in America, you spoke English, and you probably were Protestant. Women got the vote. That alone is something that made the society different than other times. Again, commingling, which meant black and white, an amalgamation. So the issue was here, and we'll see that I think the fear of the well-to-do whites was that their daughters, in particular, would have mingle and have sex, if you will, with black males. There wasn't really any pushback against white men having sex with black women, but the fact that if the white women had sex and children with black males, that would slowly dilute the stock, the blood, if you will, of the white race, and slowly that race would disappear. We had, again, eugenics, or what was called racial hygiene, or scientific racism. We had the Red Scare. The communists and the Bolsheviks were pushing back against capitalism. It was scared a lot of Americans. We had the New Negro movement of John Locke, which was promoting racial dignity, black dignity, if you will, and to stand up against Jim Crow. We had Darwinism, and which was hooked up with eugenics, because the survival of the fittest was how we rationalized society, and so Darwinism and the Scopes trial influenced a lot of people's thoughts. We had parochial school laws. There were laws in several states that if you were between 6 and 16, you had to go to public school. And we'll see here where the Indianapolis public schools pushed and made sure that the Bible and the Lord's Prayer the Bible was read in school, and the Lord's Prayer was spoken, but that was not the Catholic Bible, that was the Protestant Bible. We had what was called the Nordic movement, and white supremacy, and the push for the superiority of Anglo-Saxons. We had what's called the hyphenates. Here's the hyphenate right here. You weren't born here, you're from Germany, you came to America, you immigrated, so you were a German American. You were a Greek American. So you were called hyphenates. And these hyphenates weren't as popular as those born here, 100% Americans. You had this headline here, Gandhi is the foe of civilization. You had a lot of people joining a lot of groups. The Knights of Pythias, the Shrine, the Knights of Columbus, the Knights of Templar. These are organizations that were social organizations, but they were also religious and political organizations. You had, in 1921, 66 lynchings. 59 were black, 2 black females, so 57 black males were lynched in 1921. The TB rate was 130 per 1,000. And we'll find out how the Chamber of Commerce used the fact that they felt that black folks had an over amount of TB, and that was another reason to segregate them and put them in their own neighborhoods, put them in their own schools. You had Bible Belt fundamentalism and preacher Billy Sunday promoting Protestant fundamentalism here in the Midwest. You had the eugenics classes at Shortridge High School. You had 2 people here, the Reverend Gerald L. K. Smith, we'll find out about him, and Mrs. Otto J. Daisy Dees, who lived up basically at 38th and Boulevard. You had spike fences. If a person moved in, a person of color moved into a white neighborhood, both his neighbors or her neighbors on either side would build a 6-foot-high fence to spite that person, to cut them off, to ignore them, to isolate them. We'll see that a gentleman took some people to court. I won't tell you what happened, but we will finally talk about that. We had what was called the blind tigers, or where you could go and get an illegal drink. You had Sigmund Freud discovering the unconscious. That itself was a huge thing that influenced how people thought and how they saw the world and other people. And finally, here in Naptown, you had Marcus Garvey came to speak in March of 1922, because we'll find out, were there local African Americans who, we know they're looking at the school board records, there were groups of black folks that came and spoke against addicts. They didn't want addicts. But were there people who wanted addicts? Were there some back to Africa separatists or those who didn't want to integrate won a Attucks High School. Let's look at the amount of immigration that came in from Europe, which made the chamber, the business community, the cultural elites, the political elites, the people in power who ran Indianapolis feel that they were being overwhelmed by these people from Europe, because they were mainly born here and these people were immigrants. Altogether, looks like there were some 6 million immigrants coming in from Europe in the period we're talking about, 1840 to 1920. A lot of Irish, and mainly here, a lot of Russians and other European countries. And again, some from Asia. Let's look at basically what was influencing the decisions about Attucks High School and the other high schools that they decided in late 1922 to do, to create Attucks. What we had was the first Great Migration of poor whites and blacks, mainly blacks, coming from the south to the north. Here we see a lot of those from Alabama and Mississippi probably ended up in Indianapolis. This, I didn't know about this. A lot of Louisiana ended up in Seattle. But this is probably those who influenced Indianapolis came from here. And it looked like that there was around 1.5 million African Americans came up during the Great Migration. And in Indianapolis, from 1910 to 1920, 11% increase in the number of black folks in Indianapolis to close to 35,000. Here we have in 1964, Shortridge opens, and in 1895, here's Shortridge down on the corner of Michigan and Pennsylvania, where the federal building is today. That building that has the color mural around it and gets bigger. It's right there at the K Park building, and of course Manual at 501 South Meridian. But there was also two events here. Wise, could you tell everybody about the importance of these education laws of 1869 and 1877?
Thanks, John. What I'm going to do, I'm going to explain the 1869 and the 1877 law. But John, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back a little bit to kind of give a context. So what we're going to do, we're going to start in 1816, Indiana's first state constitution. 1816, Indiana's first constitution, the General Assembly is to create an education system whenever it feels that, not so much feel the need to, but when time is permitted, they are to create an educated system that is openly accessible and equal to all. This is 1816. Interestingly, prior to the Civil War, Indiana was the only northern state that was backwards when it came to education. Like most of the other northern places, Chicago, Illinois, Ohio, places like that, Chicago, Ohio, and other northern cities, they were already more advanced than Indiana when it came to education, access at least to public education. It's not until 1837 that school law stated that white inhabitants of each congressional township were to constitute a body politic for carrying out the provisions of the law of 1816. So what I'm saying is that in 1816, they were to create an educated system, a graded system that goes from the township schools to the state schools. They didn't do nothing with that up until 1837, that you get this law that states that they are to constitute a body of law to enact the 1816 law. So that's in 1837. What you also get is in 1841, an act of 1841 which permitted householders of a district to levy a special tax for school purposes, contained the proviso that property of blacks and mulattoes are not to be assessed for school purposes. Now, what does this mean? This means that black freeholders, black landowners, black families who had land, their taxes were not to be collected to keep them from enjoying the schooling, to keep them from having their children to go to school with white students. So what this initially did, not only did they not collect property taxes from black families, but this also kept them from voting on the school board body politic that in 1837 they were to create. So what this does, they essentially marginalize and disenfranchise black children from being a part of the state's beginning education program. Now this is decades before the Civil War. Now we're at 1841. Now in 1842, now I want to mention this. The first Indiana school laws made no mention of color. So therefore we can assume that education was supposed to be accessible to all. But the interesting thing is that in 1842, a petition was presented to the state Senate asking a law to prevent black and mulatto children from being forced into the district schools contrary to the people concerned. So basically, there's something that the body politic, white residents in rural areas, they want to have a law that's going to keep black students out of their township schools. So they're fighting this. I'm giving this historical analysis because I want people to understand that this is the origins of how IPS school system is beginning. The building blocks are being laid here. Then in 1843, the school section of the revised laws of 1843 incorporated a provision that public schools were open to the white children of the state between the ages of 5 and 21. So now they mention color, white students. They don't mention color, children of color. They don't mention them. Now, in 1846 through 1848, the Indiana Supreme Court explained that blacks were excluded by the legislature not because they did not need education, nor because their wealth was such as to render an aid undesirable, but because black children were deemed unfit associates with white school companions. This is one element of the reason why they felt like black children should not be in school with white children. Now we get to this convention in 1847 of black leaders here in the city of Indianapolis. They go to this convention, they write out this petition warning and protesting for access to public education. But in response to that, an 1850 amendment gave the so in response to this 1847 convention, in 1850, an amendment gave the masters of black children the options of ignoring an 1843 law since black children were born. So basically, what ended up happening was that in 1847, black leaders in the city of Indianapolis say that, you know what, we want equal access to public education for our students. In response to this, city leaders, the power dynamic in 1850 says, you know what, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of an 1843 law that specifically states that children who are apprentices, black children who are apprentices under their masters, and what I mean by masters, people that they're learning a trade from, they no longer have to be educated. So now these masters of these apprentices, they no longer have to educate the apprentices how to read, write, and do mathematics. This is in response to the protesting of the black leaders in 1847. So what you have here is black leaders fighting for access to public education, but in reaction to that, the city's power structure, the state's power structure says, since you're asking for that equal access, then we're going to take away whatever access that you have now, because they said black children were barred from public schools anyway. So this is the aura of how the IPS school system was created. Now, going back to the 1869 education law admitted black. Now, prior to 1869, there was no state law, city law, local law on the books that gave black children access to public education prior to 1869. So, prior to 1869, in 1867, in an interview with J Richardson, he alludes to an 1867 permissive act. what is this permissive act? Well, this permissive act is an act that's telling these township schools, because at the time there was nothing centrally located as to what we would know as the IPS school board. At the time you had townships having their own school boards. So what they decide is that in this 1867 permissive act that Henry J. Richardson alludes to, is saying that you don't have to segregate, but if you want to, you can. You can create separate schools. We're not forcing you to. Now, why is this important? Because in actuality, this benefits the white community either or. Let me give an example. If they are forced to, it's only going along with what they wanted to do anyway. Create separate schools and segregate children. But since they're not forced to, they're still given an option to segregate what they want to do anyway. So really this 1867 permissive act is really giving them advantage either or. Forced or unforced. 1877 education law was amended. This read that whenever a child attending a black school showed he or she was prepared to be placed in a higher grade than that afforded by the black school, they were to be admitted to the school. IPS chose the option to maintain segregated grade schools except in areas already integrated. So what that is alluding to was that they still had the option to create segregated schools. No one was forcing them to integrate. They could segregate. One of the dynamics, well, one of the elements of this law was that since there were no actual black high schools, if a student showed that they were intelligent enough or had the intellectual depth to be successful in white high schools, then they had to take an exam and it had to be okay through a body politic. Now, what ends up happening is that, going to what you were saying, John, large amounts of Southern, Eastern European immigrants, not only that, but blacks who used to live in the rural part of the state and blacks who are moving from the southern and the upper and lower parts of the southern states are now encroaching. So now you're getting this heavy population that's starting to encroach on the city. The city of Indianapolis, the white Protestant city of Indianapolis, I got to make that clear, they're nervous. There's anxiety. So they need to create a school system that is going to do what? Take care of this overcrowding of blacks that are in the elementary schools. So what they decide to do was, going back to this, they decide that they're going to develop a school system. Prior to this is important for people to know, Indianapolis didn't have school districts prior to segregation. So what I'm saying is that Indianapolis essentially created, and this is the first time in U.S. history, they create an actually segregated school system based off districts. This is what leads to them the 1927. Now, the school was ready in 1927, but these choices were made back in 1921. The proposition to get Shortridge built, what was formerly Indianapolis High School, started in 1919. So what I'm saying is that this was a process that was consistently being discussed and talked about without community discussion, without the black community being aware of this. The decisions were already made. They were going to create this school system to alleviate white residents, and this is important, because John and I, we talk about the Chamber of Commerce, we talk about the Civics Federation organization, but those organizations were feeling the pressure from white residents, white community residents. Three of these community associations were the Mapleton Civic Association, the White Protection League, and I think the Citizens White Protection. So you had three neighborhood associations who were going, and this is important, they were actually going to the school board, to the actual meetings, and writing down petitions that were exclaiming, screaming that they wanted segregated schools. This is how the Indianapolis school system was brought in. This is how it was ushered in, through this idea of white Protestant ideology should permeate the city, but it should permeate the city in ways where blacks are left to their own will, white Protestant are left to their own will, and the southern and eastern immigrants, let's leave them to their will on another side of the city. So IPS was really created out of the idea that we wanted to have sections of the cities for each culture, each race that we didn't want to deal with. So there you go.
Yeah, you're right, Wise, because this is what Henry J. Richardson called one big deal. That's one big deal. And we got to let the people know that Mapleton was 38th Street. So the Mapleton Civic Association was up there around 38th and Boulevard, 38th and Capitol, Butler area. We see here again, and this is going to reflect what Wise was saying. What we have here is Shortridge opening up in 1864, 5 blocks north of Washington Street. We have Manual opening up in 1895, 5 blocks south of Washington Street. This was basically the college preparatory school. Doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs would go to this school. Manual would be the manual school. For example, Manual had Manual had blacksmithing. Did Shortridge have blacksmithing? No. Did Shortridge want blacksmithing? No. So from the beginning of the school system, we had a distinction between who's going to run things and who was going to follow. Who was going to be the workers, who were going to be the owners of power and businesses. Again, here's Manual High School. Here's where the blacksmithing and all those auto trades, the Manual School. Another person that's going to influence how educated the Chamber of Commerce, Federal Pacific Clubs people, how they're educated, who influenced them from their level of society, their level of education. And this gentleman here was none other than David Starr Jordan. He was born in Gainesville, New York, but he ended up here in Indianapolis, and he taught at, he became a world-renowned eugenicist. But we see here that he taught science at Shortridge for a year. He ended up teaching biology here for a while at Butler. I'm not sure what kind of degree he got out of Butler, but he did come out with a degree. He went down to IU where he taught natural history, and I think he got either a doctorate, a PhD, or he did go to the medical school down there. I'm not sure. I looked at several sources, and there's conflicting research. But he became IU president from 1884 to 1891. At that time, the youngest president of a university in the United States. Then he was doing so well that he was brought out to Stanford. Stanford University just opened. He became the founding president of Stanford. What he did that is relevant, not only his teaching here in Indianapolis and at IU and at Butler, and being a world-renowned eugenicist, which was basically scientific racism, and we'll get to what eugenics was here soon, was that he brought 2 of his outstanding students. He had a couple students at IU when he taught, and that was Lewis Madison Terman, who basically was the father of the Stanford Binet IQ test. A Hoosier was involved in creating this IQ test, determining the intelligence of people. I don't know on what factors, but it was eugenics based, so it had to be on basically the white Anglo-Saxon male as the a perfect person, and the intelligence of that group of people was used to determine how smart other people were. And he brought out none other than Elwood Cubberley, who was the father of tracking. They came up and said, basically, bricklayers don't need Shakespeare, so let's give them a test and see if what track they're going to be on. This is called the science of school management. Basically, though, we're going to see that all the testing did was to sort and rank students. Another interesting figure was Oscar McCulloch, who was a reverend here in Indianapolis. Interesting, there was a tribe called the Ben Ishmael tribe. They lived in Indianapolis, and they were Moorish Americans, if you will. And their problem was that they worked, but they weren't in the wage labor economy. They probably didn't get receipts. They probably got paid cash money, or they had traded for their work. And so they became suspect of Mr. McCulloch, who wondered if they were trying to be what they called back then professional beggars. And what was big back then was they were trying to organize the charity groups into forming one group so they could really help people. And part of their thing they wanted to do was to find out who really needed help and who didn't. And what he did some research on this tribe of Ishmael, and he believed that they were genetically predisposed to not want to work, and genetically predisposed to want money for not working, and if we will, these professional beggars. And he believed, and other researchers believed, that these type of people need to be sterilized because he felt that certain people were born with a pauper gene, a propensity to be poor and stay poor. And so if you had that gene and you lived and you were born in a well-to-do family, that gene, that propensity wouldn't come out. But if you were born in a family that had a reputation where your dad didn't work, your uncles didn't work, and so you were born in that family, you'd have a propensity to also be lazy and poor and not want to work. So this was used by researchers to justify not giving help to certain people, and to justify eugenics laws that these certain types of people need to be sterilized. And we'll find out that that happened. And we'll see that McCulloch finally said he reconsidered his theory. But for a minute, he was a star in America as a prominent citizen pushing for a reform of charitable outlooks and orientations. And this Indianapolis charity organization was the precursor to the United Way. And at that time, and still, it ranked as one of the largest, most comprehensive charity organizations in the United States. So he influenced how we looked upon a lot of people who were different than the people in power. We'll see here that in Indiana, because of the Zeitgeist, because of how people were thinking, that we passed the world's first eugenics law, which required certain people who we thought were criminals or idiots or imbeciles or rapists to be sterilized involuntarily. So if my wife was an imbecile, or if you will, and I was an imbecile, they didn't want us to have children who would then be imbeciles. If I was, if my dad was in jail and my uncles were in jail and all my family were in jail, most likely my children would be criminals, so they wanted to sterilize me. And that became a law. In fact, we'll see that during the Nuremberg trials, that when they asked the Nazis how they were able to have such a great sterilization program, they said, we followed the Indiana procedure. They looked at what Indiana was doing and followed that. This is a link here to that fact. Arsenal Tech opened in 1912, and here's another book here, The Passing of the Great Race. Again, people, white people of repute and power and education felt that the races of color were coming in on them, and they would finally be eliminated. That their race was going to be, and that they needed eugenics to save the white race. Here's the part of the philosophy of eugenics. Hygiene will prevent any crime. So if we made sure that certain criminals, or male and female, were sterilized and couldn't have children, we would be assuring the health of society. And here's the book by Starr. They thought that the people of color were going to come and take over because the Europeans, of course, were not, I don't know what percentage of the world population they were, but it wasn't that much. So they felt that all the people of color, yellow, brown, black, were going to come in and eliminate them eventually. Let's look real quick here. Let's go through 1921 real quick to see what was going on that influenced, again, these leaders of Indianapolis, these bankers, these lawyers, these well-educated people to create a Jim Crow IPS public school system. When I opened, what I did, I went through every paper. I went through every day of the Indianapolis Star of 1921. And it was odd, when I opened it up, the first Star was a editorial on the large race riot that happened the year before in December in Kansas. There was an article here that now that women could vote, their social groups were getting away from promoting a social culture to be concerned with more political affairs. We see here there was a hair tonic party downtown. Now this is a code word for that you can come and have a drink, because the hair tonic that they were using for their head, to put on their hair, was 68% alcohol. So, but it was called a hair tonic party to cover up the fact that it was alcohol. Well, we see that President Harding became a 32nd degree Mason. And this is something unusual about Indianapolis. This is where Dr. Lucia Merriweather, a dentist, went to the judge and he wanted $10,000 to suing these people who lived on either side of him to remove their fences, their spike fences that they built to spite him, to isolate him, to force him to leave, because they're 27, around 24th and Capitol, where he moved in, the Capitol Avenue Protection Association wanted to prevent people of color from moving into the neighborhood. So they built this fence hoping that he would leave. The Irish and the English were at war. America for Americans. An Indianapolis pastor wants immigrants to assimilate. The League of Women Voters were pushing for citizenship education. A woman was elected to the school board, and here we had a nationwide roundup of illegals who sounds like what Mr. Trump wants, to round up people who were illegal, Japanese, Chinese, and Mexicans, who were called ineligibles. And that's what they did, rounded up. Here's that famous, the important data here. More people live now in the city than in the country. Butler's population grew in 1 year to 90 students. We had the steel unions fighting up in Gary. We had radicals. They thought communists were everywhere, and they investigated the post office workforce. The United States faced a $2 billion war debt. And the Indy Chamber of Commerce were carrying out Americanization classes. The League of Nations was 1 year old. And the blue laws were coming in. Of course, the Jewish didn't follow the Protestant laws, and they were encouraged to drink wine on Sunday. And the Greeks and Turks were at war. We had here that jazz music, this is the article, that jazz music made Native Americans go wild. That the drums and the horns made them act uncivilized. In fact, too, they wanted to bar American Indian youth from doing the shimmy or the tala, which was the dance, during the 20s. The Japanese invaded Manchuria, and we have mob went to jail, lynches Negroes, if you will, and they invaded the jail. 150 white men, masked white men, entered the jail and killed 2 black men. One in particular was arguing with a store clerk over some apples that he bought. Here's Tutwiler, the head of the board, wants the Bible read in school. Again, that's the Protestant Bible, that's not the Catholic Bible. And the Lord's Prayer. And of course, TB was increasing. So that was just 1 month. Let's go to February 1921. Stay with me. There were 15,000 people dying per hour in China. according to the newspaper. The White Plague, they found out, were mainly people who were laborers and housewives and cooks and waiters, mostly black people who were working in lunchrooms and hotels and private homes, and janitors, because we'll find out that that was used as an excuse by the chamber to create an Addicts High School and to isolate that community from the broader community. Another race war in Springfield, Ohio. The Starr editorial board said IPS had bad working conditions. The schools were not were inferior physically. Here we had an editorial that a editorial page column someone wrote into the Starr editorial on the weekly notes from Missionary Field basically said that why should we disturb the heathens in the East, because he called that they practiced and believed in the religion of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Mohammedanism were false religions. Again, on March 15th, big efforts to push back against the hyphenates. And here in March, the KKK established an office here in Indy. We'll see here, though, that part of what was going on back then, what was called the white man's burden, that the burden of America to educate and uplift all the people of color around the world. And here they are, this is their burden. It's up to them to civilize and all these people of color in the world. Let's look at, this is a Klan map of Indianapolis in 1923. Each of these asterisks up here are 1,000 Klansmen. And we're going to see that you see a lot of Klan cells up here, because according to J Richardson, there were 3 Klan cells in Indianapolis. Riverside, 30th up in here, Fountain Square, and Brightwood. And you can see, I think even up through the 70s, when I was here in Indianapolis, few, if any, blacks lived south of Massachusetts Avenue. There was so you could see this, the Klan lining up here to keep the blacks in Brightwood. Here, lining up, if you will, to keep blacks in this area. And we'll find out that in 1926, that when the Klan, if you will, won the election, that the city council passed a law that no blacks could live north of 30th Street. So this is part of that pushback by the Klan to keep blacks. Here are the 2 main areas in those areas. The Chamber of Commerce says it is now ready to make the Hoosier capital a classic among the sisterhood of states. So the Chamber was beginning to flex its muscles and be a player in Indianapolis. Wise, could you tell us a little bit more about the Chamber of Commerce?
All right. So the Chamber of Commerce, Philip Zolker, chair lawyer for 22 years, was a member of the Indiana State Tax Commission in the 1920s, known for opposing those IPS board members who wanted more taxes for pay for more schools. We got John Atherton, financial secretary and later Butler's secretary treasurer. He looked out for Butler's financial interests. He served on the board and was widely known in Indiana for his civic leadership as a member of the city's planning commission and the board of zoning appeals for 23 years, where he served as president for both for many years. Then you got people like Richard T. Buchanan, personal secretary of Senator Samuel M. Ralston, writer for the Indianapolis News. Then you got Paul H. Buchanan, president and chairman of the board of Flanner and Buchanan Mortuaries. You have Clinton H. Given, attorney, Superior Court judge, Marion County representative to the Indiana General Assembly. You got Dr. Alfred Henry, president of the Indianapolis State Tuberculosis Association, prominent physician, president of the Rotary Club, Scottish Rite, Marat Shrine. Then you got M.S. M.E. Hoagland, New York State Library Schools. She was a librarian. Curtis Hodges, T.C. Howe, New Irvington Club, Century Club, professor, chairman of the Alumni Committee, social elite, Butler University president. So basically, John, what I'm getting at, these were social elites. These were people who were a part of the city's power structure. They went to extravagant parties, galas, however you want to call them. And this is where they determined and made policy, not in boardrooms, but at these gatherings, at these social gatherings. These were individuals who were very conservative in their moral outlook of the city. These were individuals that wanted less federal government intrusion in politics. They wanted to be left alone. They are what I would consider today a combination of neoliberals, libertarians, and conservatives. So in that sense, they were individuals that saw the city being something based off their ideology of how they wanted the city structured. White Protestant, particularly white Protestant male. So basically that is the Chamber of Commerce. Rich social elites who were mainly living north of Indianapolis in places like the Meridian Hills Club. Give you an example, the Rotary Club. Now, what's interesting about these clubs is that they were exclusively for white people. Blacks were left to form their own fraternal, sorority organizations. But these individuals, a part of the Chamber of Commerce, they were civic leaders. You know, they weren't elected by city officials. They weren't elected by the city residents. They were elected by the power structures within those circles. They were appointed, nominated by those people to take care of business, to make sure that Indianapolis looked white. And that was the real issue. They wanted Indianapolis to look white. Later on, when McNutt becomes, I believe, governor, McNutt comes in, and he comes in with all of these New Deal policies because of FDR. Well, that is until 1940. From 1940 to 1960, this city's power structure, they're very hell-bent on turning it back to a conservative, neoliberal plan. We want control of the fiscal management. We want control of what education looks like. We want controls of what the cities, the roads, the residents, the community looks like. This was the Chamber of Commerce, the city's power structure. White elites, white social elites who gathered together at these galas, at these social events, and created policy, created legislation, created the landscape, you know, that would take shape in what you see today as Indianapolis. And also, if you look, 21% were women, 21% were business people, 19 politicians. Now, this is important because at this time, women have now just got it. They have now just received the right to vote. But I say this is particularly important, particularly with the women, because the women who were married to these men who were power brokers, they would throw on the weekends and throughout the weekdays, they would throw these extravagant gatherings, weddings, fundraisers, drama clubs, viewings of art, book clubs. I mean, an example is what they will have in Indianapolis today, the Penrod Art Festival. Festivals like that is what the women of the household, this is what they would do to make sure that they were seen in with the social elites, to make sure that they kept themselves infused, saturated in the powerful elite, the body politic that will control Indiana, that will control the city. 5% work for government. That just let you know they were not keen on government. They were more keen on creating government. And that's important. They didn't work for government. They were keen on creating government. 24% were involved with social organizations. This is key because it's social organizations who shape the ideology of white residents who are not in this power structure. So what you have is this power structure of white elites who are informing and shaping what white residents should want. And they're actually shaping what white residents are going to look at the others as. This is important. 21% are lawyers. 24% are educated, and this is also important. You had a very high percentage of them who were educated. Educated coming from these elite colleges that were only built for them, that were maintained and kept up for them. So, yeah, 2% in medicine, 2% in church. So, if you notice, they're putting a lot of emphasis on people who can make things happen. Women, business people, politicians, organizations. Why are these organizations important? Because these organizations bring in what? Money, fundraisers. They're boosters. That's why those organizations are. And those organizations, 24% involved with clubs and organizations, those organizations are highly tied with the women because it was the women who led a lot of these organizational gatherings. 24% education, lawyers, they were going to be the ones, the lawyers were the one that was going to, map out legislation that was going to justify some of the segregated and debilitating practices which kept blacks from enjoying some of the amenities and concessions that were well received by whites. So this is what the Chamber of Commerce is, and this is the structure that they were part of. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, John Harris-Loflin.
We see here, thanks, Wise. We see here that the judge ruled in favor that the spike fences were illegal. Thank you, Wise. We can see here, too, on April 29th, that the judge ruled for Dr. Merriweather, and he gets $10,000. The spike fences were illegal, and he got the $10,000 and to have them removed. May 1921, we see there's around IPS gains more students. Still, counting grade school, 11% of IPS back in 21 was African American. We had a big parade. 2,500 people prayed for the Knights Templar. And here again, in May and June, a big, unfortunate, a terrible race riot in Greenwood and Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Oklahoma race riots. 2 days where some 300 were killed. And the whites led a racially motivated attack on the black community. So again, people in the in Indianapolis are seeing this happen. So I know that the chamber doesn't want a race riot in Indianapolis. We know that. So let's see. Now we're going to see here, because I'm going to show what the relationship between Shortridge and Butler. Butler was known as the Shortridge Annex, according to Mr. Hendrickson in his book. So we have on June 1st, the Shortridge PTA petitions the board for a new Shortridge. Now, Wise, you said that happened in 1919 or 17. So that word was already out, and we knew way back then that they wanted a new Shortridge. Because as you saw, they were downtown, and they wanted to not stay downtown, evidently. Marion County has almost 83,000 students, 5% of which are African American. Now Butler, within 10 days, say they're going to move. So Butler says they're going to relocate in Fairview Park, which is where Butler is now, where the Christian Theological Seminary is. It's where the field house is. It's where the planetarium is. That's where all that beautiful gardens are. And it's where the university is now. It's Fairview Park. So we see within 10 days, because we're going to find out that both Shortridge and Butler opened the same month, the same year, 1928, together. And that there was a connection between those two schools and between the two movements to have those schools leave inner city, or leave Indianapolis, if you will, and move out farther north. Here again, the business community is supporting a Butler. Shortridge alumni want a Butler. Even now that the Starr is in, they want a greater Butler. So that Indianapolis can have a university-level institution on par with other great cities. And we're going to see here that a part of this was sports. that Indianapolis can be also a sports capital. Here, Indianapolis is concerned, because all of this is in the Starr, concerned with the number of foreign-born people. So Indianapolis here had almost 17,000 foreign-born, and they were concerned with that because they were the hyphenates: Romanian Americans, Hungarian Americans, Russian Americans. But remember here, Shortridge, the Butler was called the Shortridge Annex because many of the Butler students, after they graduated, went to Butler. Hilton U. Brown, the head of the news, was selected as the president of the board. And here was the issue in the Starr editorial that the drift of Negro population from the south to the north looks like that the latest census showed that 40% more blacks in the north than there were in the past. And the south now has 9 million African Americans, and the north has 1,500,000. Now, another thing that was going on was what was going on in the Indianapolis Starr. Here we have I found out, and again, most people who read the Starr were educated, and but let's see some of this other stuff that influenced them. This was something for children. It was called the Daily Corner for Junior Readers, drawing lessons for our kiddies. A bottle of ink has turned into a pickaninny. So here we have your average little girl. She wasn't poor. She don't look poor to me. Probably up there at 30th and Capitol drawing. And this is what she was drawing here, the little pickaninny child. And this was probably normal. This was a good thing to do, fun. Let's sit down and draw. And of course, this portrayed the African American as well. Let's see. Let's see some other cartoons. Chick Jackson was the Starr's cartoonist from 1913 to 1934. Usually, if you look at it, it's 5 days a week, 6 days a week, not usually on Sunday. He did, basically this is his theme, where the gentleman, Mr. B and Mrs. B, it was mainly about their life, and this is their maid, but it was mainly about him, and he would talk about women, and she'd talk about family affairs and her neighbors and things. But sometimes he would have cartoons like this where he's portraying black folks. I mean, I've never seen an actual person who looked like this ever. Maybe in a movie that they were made up to be like that, but he's acting like these people actually exist. He's a serious cartoonist. He's the Starr's cartoonist. He ain't some cartoonist from some other place. He's the Starr's official cartoonist for over 20 years here. Here's another cartoon that appeared in the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, because his cartoons were in other papers around the state. And this is how he's portraying. Here's the Mr. B's maid, and this must be her help. And again, I've never seen anybody look like this. But how they're portraying black folks here as clownish. It appears to be an average way you look at African Americans. And here they're having something, and she says, I got to get you out of here. I'm going to put you in the closet here for a while, and until I decide how to react to your crazy responses to what was going on. So again, the chamber children and the chamber people who read the Starr lived with this as the normal way of looking at African Americans. In August 1921, 95% of Indiana white people. Sir Philip Gibbs, dispatched from London, current world crisis finds inaction, fate of whites and balance. Again, they were afraid that the white race would disappear if they weren't able to save it. Of course, here the British killed 700 Indians in that revolt in India. Here was another thing that we have to understand and appreciate what the educated white Protestant male, females, society, business elites, cultural elites, a challenge of the 1920s came in the form of the Cubists or the Dada art movement, that the Cubists didn't paint a tree as a tree. They did it in blocks. A tree didn't look like a tree. It looked like a series of blocks. And this was considered not art at all. And Dada was a movement that mocked materialistic and nationalistic attitudes. So this is another thing that scared, I think, the business cultural elites in Indianapolis. Now notice, I said previously that there were some states that passed parochial laws. There were laws forcing all people, all children between 6 and 16 into public schools. So in reaction to that, in this chess game, if you will, Cathedral opens up a school at 14th and Penn, realizing, I think, that if they didn't have these schools, they may have to go to public schools, read the Protestant Bible, say, not against, I'm sure they practiced the Lord's Prayer, but it wasn't the Catholic Bible, and that they would be indoctrinated into the Protestant worldview in public schools. So they opened up a school at 14th and Penn, and we'll find out later in the same day, the same month that Attucks opened, Cathedral opens its larger school at 14th and Meridian. This is the beginning right here. Again, Marcus Garvey came to Indianapolis to speak. I don't know what he said. He spoke at various locations here in town. I'd love to know what he said. Of course, IPS gains more students, which means we need to build more schools. The local chamber was seeking 10,000 new members, as though they didn't have enough. Here in October 1924, the Citizen School Committee formed. Wise, could you tell us a little bit about the Citizen School Committee?
The Citizen School Committee was a slate that started in 1921. The skinny is, they were upset at the Better School League. They felt that the Better School League was mismanaging the funds, were not taking care of the educational problem that they felt were encroaching, that they felt was, black population encroaching upon. Too many blacks are in our schools. The Better School Leagues are not doing anything about it, so we're going to create an organization, the Citizen School League, known as the Little School Slate, which in 1921 they will eventually win. But going back to that, the Citizen School Committee had individuals on there such as, just to name one, you got Fred C. Dickinson, Columbia Club Committee's treasurer, director, board of directors, vice president of Union Trust, president of the Indiana Trust Company, real estate, banking, Scottish Rite, Marat Shrine, and he resided on 1454th North Delaware. You got George L. Denny, mayor of Indianapolis from 1947, 1948, Republican lawyer. Also, you got Broadhurst Easley, Board of Trade, Indianapolis Secretary and Treasurer for the Indianapolis Glove Company, President of the Crystal Moore Settlement Association, Board of Directors for Utilities. Then you got James W. Fessler, Indiana University trustee, ran for governor in 1920, law firm. He was part of a law firm. Really, the skinny is, John, these were the same type of individuals who were just like the Chamber of Commerce. Except with the Citizen School Committee, you had social elites creating and going through with an agenda that they as community members. So this is the key. You have the Chamber, but the Chamber is in direct control of the Citizen School Committee. Matter of fact, the Chamber and the Citizen School Committee are really interchangeable as far as professions, as far as social elites, as far as white residents. But except it's the Chamber who is deciding who is going to be on the Citizen School Committee, because they need people that are going to go along with this agenda. Let's break down the numbers. Again, 19% are women. I keep emphasizing it was Mary Otto J. Deeds who was leading her group, who was advocating that I forget the term, she was advocating that pure red blood white males join her group. She was, so women are really leading this cause in the sense that they're fearing for their children's lives. Now, what they tried to hide it under was tuberculosis. But the reality was, I have yet to see the numbers on how many black families, black children at that time were diagnosed with tuberculosis. The numbers are not out, but this was something that they were using as an excuse as to why these schools should be created. 49% are business people. Why? They needed a business type of structure and model to go along with the city's initiative. It was going to be the business elite that were going to shape the way that education was going to look like. Now, later on in my other piece, I'm going to tie this business, as why this business part was important. 13% are politicians. Politicians have the network. They have the access to make sure that this legislation, make sure that these policies of segregated school systems, separate schools they have the wherewithal, the networking, the access to make sure that these initiatives go through. Then you got bankers. You need somebody to provide the funding, the money for it. Again, 16% work for government. Now, these particular people who work for government, that goes back. If you notice, the chamber did not have a lot of people that work for government, but the Citizen School Committee does. Why? Because it was the Chamber of Commerce who picked these people. They handpicked these people for the Citizen School Committee government to work for them. Now you got 20, again, a large portion of them are involved with clubs, organizations, the Columbia Club, the Chamber, the Red Cross, and the Masons. These are, now, John, real quick, the reason why these organizations are important, because you marry into these families. White men graduate, but they need to be a part of the city's power structure. So they marry into another family that has already had some type of status in the city, so they can keep this power vacuum, keep on rolling. These are why and the way that you do that is by establishing these organizations, these fraternal clubs, these Woodstock clubs, these Meridian Hill clubs, these New Irvington country clubs, these neighborhood associations. This is how you meet the powerful elite. This is how you get in good with the family. This is how you make a name for yourself. Can you pay to play? That's important. Can you pay to play? 13% involved with social groups, societies, women's suffrage, local histories and sororities. This is important. Because Emma Lou Thornborough, great scholar out of the University of Butler, she says that a lot of these organizations were patronizing and paternalistic. What she means by that is that when TB was such a fright, when blacks needed some type of access to public accommodations, instead of asking blacks, did they need help, they just went through and tell them, oh, you need to do this, because this is going to make you do this because it benefits us. So these social organizations became these pseudo-philanthropic organizations that, under the guise, we have your best interest, but no, they were making sure that their interest was being dealt with. Creating these schools was one of the very first things that they had to do. Getting rid of the Negro problem. Going back to this, the Indianapolis Times, who won a Pulitzer Prize for what? Exposing the Klan, was the same paper that advocated a segregated school system based off the white sentiment, the white racial attitudes that existed and that were purveying at that time. You also got 13% are lawyers, and then 19% are teachers. This is important. Here it is, you have teachers who are supposed to be democratic in their teaching and their values and their principles about teaching, but they don't want black students. Matter of fact, white teachers don't even want to go to black schools. White teachers don't even want to deal with black students. John alluded to why Shortridge had to be built. Well, up until that particular time, up until about 1919, Shortridge found itself on the fringe of the business community, right there on the edges of where the black slums were at. They had to move Shortridge from that. Parents were freaking out. We don't want black children going to school with our white, well-to-do children. And not just that, not just black children, but poor Southern and Eastern immigrants were going to this school too. So they had to find another school for them to go to. This, and then real estate. Now, real estate is important Because even though you didn't have a lot of the real estate in there, but you did have a memo that went out in 1926, a 1926 ordinance that state, and John alluded to it, you can't move past 30th Street. Now, even though the ordinance was shut down in November of 26 because it was deemed by the Indiana Supreme Court and local authorities, it was deemed unconstitutional, that doesn't mean that it wasn't enforced. It was still going on. Up until about the 1950s, where you started to see what? White flight. Now, white flight takes part of this, the Butler-Tarkington area. This is how you get the Butler-Tarkington neighborhood associations. But there's two associations. No one ever brings this up. The Northern Association and the Southern Association. Blacks dealt with the Southern Butler-Tarkington Association because they had their own neighborhoods. They were not allowed to move south of Butler-Tarkington because moving beyond South Butler-Tarkington, meaning that you were going to move into that dreaded area that you were not allowed, the Fairview Park area, where Butler was going to be housed at. So in this, the Citizen School Committee were very strategic in how they were going to make these deals go through. They needed someone from every level of the government, from every level of society, to make sure that this was going to go through. That's the Citizen School Committee right there in a nutshell. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John Harris-Loflin.
That when you control the schools, you control the future. We're able to want to control the schools in order to make things work out in the way they wanted. Let's look closely at this issue of what was called amalgamation or commingling and other issues of what was called the Negro problem from the white people's point of view. And it's so subtle. It was the idea, and this is President Harding, realized that the problems in the South, the black problem, was now a problem of the whole United States. So he went to Birmingham, President Harding, and made this talk basically saying that race has become a national issue, that blacks are expecting the right to vote and economic equality, but they can't expect social equality. Saying that racial amalgamation can never come to America. This is the President of the United States. It's not an issue of social equality. It's about being equal, but a fundamental difference between black and white people that we must accept. It's eternal and inescapable. So they can never be equal. The Starr likes what he said and basically said that amalgamation and commingling are issues. Though black and white may be equal in character or intelligence, and the U.S. does not want to block black progress, local black folks must accept the differences between the races and not seek admission to white social circles, but find equality of companionship among their own people. So we're glad they're voting. We're glad they're progressing economically and going to school, etc. But we can't have tea with them. We can't play cards with them. And God forbid, no swimming together. No, they just can't. They got to mix with their own kind. And this became the accepted. This made sense to a lot of people. Now, the Citizen School Committee, it's interesting here. It looks like that what we had for this election, November 21, where the Citizen School Committee won and beat out the Better Schools League, it looks like a Republican named Lou Shank, his wife was Sarah Shank, and the Sarah Shank Golf Course was named after her. He ran as an outsider Republican. He ran on the Republican ticket, but he really wasn't a Republican. And he won the election. Now, the Citizen School Committee had hooked up under Mayor, the Democrat nominee, Ralston, who lost. It looked like a lot of people split their tickets. They voted for Shank, and they voted for the Citizen School Committee. And here's the ones, and they were called the little school slates because initially they were against expanding schools. And they were called the news slate because Hilton U. Brown and the Chamber of Commerce and Lee Burns and all those guys who were part of this group of the Chamber, Citizen School Committee, and the Federation of Civic Clubs were all with Hilton U. Brown and the Indianapolis News. And remember, Hilton U. Brown became the president of the board of Butler. So we're connecting some dots here. And these are the people who won that. And these people won. They're going to come in. That should be an N, sorry. Come in 24. But these people would go into office in January 22. Let's look at December 1921. This is part of the issue. It looks like there was this club on the avenue called the Joker Young's Golden West Cabaret at 532 Indiana Avenue. And they would be open all night. And the scenario would be that a lot of young white women who would leave the house from their well-to-do families and go down and have fun and dance and have a good time on the avenue after hours at these clubs. Here we see in December 23 that at last, this is in the Starr, at last Indianapolis will have a team Butler to represent her in state and national levels. Tell us a little bit about this, Wise. What was going on here in regard to athletics and Butler? Why was this even mentioned?
Well, Butler, interestingly, Butler wanted to be known as the collegiate, they wanted to be known as the collegiate sports world. You can get a lot of this great information about Butler from John Kondalik, an expert in Butler history. Talking to Professor Guy, listening to the interview from Professor Guy, professor at Butler University, he talks about that in Butler's beginning stages, Butler wanted to be the collegiate sports world, just basically that. They created a dual governance where you were going to have an athletic department and an academic department. With these academic and athletic departments, there was a negotiation agreed upon that the academic department would stay out of the athletic department and vice versa, the athletic would stay out of the academic department. But they drew up a contract saying that if the academic part of Butler runs out of money, then they have to flip the bill on their own. But if the athletic department runs out of money, the academic department has to help the athletic department fund whatever it is that they don't have money for. In addition to that, Butler was ready in 1927. The field house was ready, but the school in itself was not ready. In Butler's early stages, the academic department was just really a shell of itself. They didn't have an actual office. They were struggling for money, struggling for funds. It was really the board, the Butler board, who put all of their resources into making sure that Butler was going to become the sports mecca of the world. This was brought on by a 1907 and 1908 idea from the Indianapolis civic leaders, politicians, chamber leaders, and other civic leadership. They wanted to rebuild or build up Indianapolis into this sports world. So they create the 16,000-seat field house, which later on it got renovated and added more seats to it. But in the beginning stages, it was 16,000 seats, but they only had 1,000 students. In addition to creating the field house, the Hinkle Field House, behind the Hinkle Field House, there was this large area where they wanted to make the Butler Bowl. And they literally wanted to seat 100,000 people for a football stadium. This was the idea of Butler, wanting to become the sports mecca of the world. There's an interview with Tony Hinkle, legendary coach at Butler Fieldhouse, where he talks about he was the only game in town, meaning that Butler was the only sports game, big sports, major sporting event in town. Indianapolis was a huge sports city. Even though they didn't have a lot of sports here, they kept their ears to the rest of the world as to what events were going on in sports, which made them a huge sports town. Later on, you would get the Indy 500. So in doing this, these are their focus. These are their goals. Butler's ready in 1927, 1928, but the problem is they run into the Great Depression. This all of their hopes, all of their dreams are crushed. Their athletic hopes are crushed because they don't have the money to fund. They've already got Hinkle, but now they don't have more resources to put into Hinkle, to establish Hinkle as a powerhouse. They definitely don't have the money, which really would have took them over the edge had they built the Butler Bowl. That really would have took them over the edge. But how are you going to have the money in the Great Depression to seat and to fund 100,000 people? That was unheard of. Even for the great college programs at that time, it was just unheard of to seat 100,000 people. So this was Butler's coming in, this was Butler's attempt in trying to make itself known to the world. And Guy talks about after this debacle, meaning after this Great Depression, they struggled from here on out. They struggled for another additional like 30, 35 years. They stayed downtown in their office. The athletic department had its office downtown. The academic department had its office downtown. And they really did not get from underneath the downtown office until about the 1960, 1965, I believe. Later on, they didn't get to where they are now in Fairfield until around that time, until like 30, 35 years later. So this is the history of Butler. I will get into a little bit more how Butler got to its location. I will get into that later.